And so if it's possible that the death rate in Italy would need to be corrected by a factor of 100, what explains, I mean, we hear that there and in so many other places that the medical system is already being overwhelmed and there are these shortages. So what would account for that if indeed the death rate is likely lower than they say it is?
I am collaborating with scientists who are leading the Italian response, and I'm trying to get their insights. And this has been a very interesting puzzle that we have been brainstorming on. There are multiple explanations so far that can be proposed on why Italy really became such a disaster. And these include the following. First of all, it's demographics. Italy has the most elderly population in Europe and one of the most elderly populations in the world. It is far more older people on average compared to a country like the US or most of the other countries. And we know very well that SARS-CoV-2 has markedly steep increase in mortality in people who are very old. The average age of people who die in Italy is 81 years old. And also, most of these people have lots of other underlying diseases. Italy is a country that has a very strong history of smoking. It has very high rates, therefore, of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. It has very high rates of coronary heart disease. And these are very strong risk factors for having a bad outcome in this infection. If you want to transplant these data to another population, you need to account for that differential case mix and try to adjust accordingly what your expectation would be in a different country. Another observation that has emerged is that many of these people probably would have had very limited life expectancy in the absence of that infection. And it still remains to be decided how many of these infections are deaths with SARS-CoV-2 versus deaths by SARS-CoV-2, meaning that the virus has the key influence on the outcome rather than just giving a final kick or participating among many other factors in shaping the outcome, but these people having multiple other reasons that they would have a very poor endpoint and eventually die, many of them. There's also other things that probably got wrong in Italy. Italy has a relatively low number of ICU beds per population. It has about a third of ICU beds per population compared to the US. And their system is running at full capacity practically every winter at 95 to 98%. So if you get just a little bit extra, you're very close to the point of collapse. And we know that in winter, there is a 25 to 30% increase in the number of deaths compared to summer months. A major part of that contribution is deaths due to respiratory pathogens, and typically every year this is due to influenza. Now this year it could be influenza plus SARS-CoV-2, but you realize that a system that is so close to saturation, to having its maximal capacity, if you add just a little bit more, it can very easily collapse. Italians were the first to be hit in Europe, and that was an exotic pathogen. Everybody thought that they had to do their best. So they said we need to admit these people to the hospital even if they had modest or not so severe symptoms. This resulted in a very bad decision making, and I think that this is something that every other setting that is hit by an epidemic wave needs to avoid. By admitting these mild or moderate cases very quickly, they became saturated, and when they started getting the severe cases, they just had no room for them. So also the hospital became heavily colonized with that new virus. This is a virus that can stay on surfaces. Many of their medical personnel got infected in that heavily infested environment. About 3,000 people in the medical personnel in Italy got infected, and they had to leave the battle to be in quarantine, making things even worse. So there's a lot of factors that created like the perfect storm. If you add to that some probably lack of strict measures in the early phases. For example, lack of strict personal hygiene might have been an issue. Large congregations. In one setting in Bergamo, which is the city that has been most hit by this pandemic to date, there was a match of Champions League that attracted wide attention, and about a third of the population of Bergamo not only saw the match, but they also celebrated until very late hours after midnight, embracing and dancing and probably kissing each other, who knows. And you had tens of thousands of people out in the street in very, very close contact. There's lots of things, I think, that explain much of what we see in Italy. We also need to consider that it is an outlier. We have 200 countries, and they have the worst outcomes today. And even within Italy, it's not the entire country. It's specific cities and specific hospitals, actually a small minority of hospitals that faced these extreme odds, and so pretty much a situation of crashing because of the load of cases.